Tom, it seems like the question that is brought up here is, who does the Pope care about more? People in developing nations that are poor, or the Western nations that are rich?
Yeah, well, in fact, it's interesting because the United Nations has a poll right now, an internet poll. They're trying to poll the world's population to find out what do they consider important, what do the public consider important. And the interesting thing is that out of the 8.4 million people who have now filled in this poll, it's called My World, and you can get online on the UN site and fill in what you think are the most important issues facing the world. Most of the people that filled in the form so far are from countries like Nigeria. They're from developing countries, which is strange. You'd think that most of them would be from the developed world, with it being an internet connection. But in fact, what most of the people in the developing countries say is that climate change is the least important of the roughly 15 things that they listed that you can vote for. They put things like fresh water, peace and security, fighting famine and poverty, having good electricity. Those are the things that the people of the world actually are telling the UN through this survey that they think are infinitely more important than whether the climate's going to change in the year 2080.
Tom, I can already hear the critics saying, if there's no Earth, if there's an Earth that's no longer inhabitable, if you will, or habitable, none of this matters.
Yeah, exactly. We need a planet to live on, and there's no Earth 2 yet. Maybe someday there will be. So what we have to do is we have to look at two factors. People talk about, well, what would happen if there was catastrophic climate change? And I say, well, by definition, it would be a catastrophe. But the same thing would be true if we were hit by a civilization-destroying asteroid. So what you have to do is you have to look at, what is the likelihood of us being the cause of dangerous climate change? What it's all based on is computer models of the future, okay? So they take these models, they plug in today's conditions, and they say, oh my God, look what's going to happen in the future. But what we have to realize is that these models are not working. For example, if you go back 50 years and you plug into conditions 50 years ago, you don't get today's conditions. And yet those models are being used to forecast climate disaster in the year 2100. So what we really have to do in any risk assessment is not just assess what are the possible outcomes, what are the consequences if this risk comes true. We also have to look at what is the likelihood of it happening. The truth is we simply don't know.
You've got the Catholic Church, and you've got the institution of the church with a pledge to help the poor and the needy. Obviously, the concentration of those folks in developing nations. Is it almost hypocritical for the Pope and the Vatican to align themselves with the UN priorities on climate change?
Yes, it is. And in fact, the UN originally, to their credit, in Copenhagen, they wanted to see half of the money spent on helping people today adapt to real climate change, natural cycles, things like desertification in the Saharan Africa or melting of the permafrost in northern Canada. They wanted half the money to go to that, the other half to go to trying to stop what might happen in the future. But what has happened is, in fact, completely the opposite. What we have now is roughly $1 billion a day being spent across the world on climate finance. And 93% of it, almost all of it, is going to try to stop what might happen in the distant future. When I was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, I was speaking to the second in charge of the Ethiopian delegation, and he pointed to the TV screen where all the protesters were outside, and he said, Tom, those people are crazy. And I said, what do you mean? Don't you think we cause dangerous climate change? Because I hadn't revealed my position that we are not doing that. And he said, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but I know that we need help today. Yet all those protesters and this whole conference are focused on what might happen generations in the future. He said it's crazy.
I think what this says is that you cannot make an assumption that the powers that be know everything about this issue and are standing on the right place. So it's almost like, hey, get involved in this because it's still very fluid.